Hello, this is Joe Trahan, welcoming you to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, whose mission is to enlighten the world to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances. As the national leader on this subject, they communicate their educational messages through various methods, including this podcast. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the All Me podcast. This is Don Hooten Jr., and today I'll be your host. Today I have a really important guest with us who comes from the field of anti-doping. Shortly, we're going to bring on Ryan Murphy, who is the Executive Director for the Partnership for Clean Competition, which going forward we're going to refer to as PCC. Every day, the PCC acts to protect the integrity of sport and public health by engaging and supporting the world's top scientists and innovators in high-quality anti-doping research and development. The PCC also facilitates adoption of these methods into the World Anti-Doping Agency accredited laboratories. The PCC aspires to help generate the world's most influential, effective, and coveted methods and resources for detecting and deterring the use of performance-enhancing substances by all athletes in all sports at all levels. Though this work, they demonstrate the value of science, collaboration, and innovation related to doping control in sport and ensure the benefits of sport participation. I'm going to talk with Ryan about the type of work they currently fund and how these grants that they've created has helped make sport cleaner and a level playing field for all athletes. From one anti-doping organization to another, help me welcome Ryan Murphy from the PCC onto the show. Hey, Ryan, welcome to the All Me podcast. Glad to have you on the show.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. It's great to come and talk with you about the work that we're doing at the Partnership for Clean Competition.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking with you and also catching up because I know we get to see each other every couple of years at the annual PCC conference. But sort of before we get going, because you're another anti-doping agency out there, a very powerful one, and we want to sort of give the listeners kind of a better understanding about you as, you know, you are the leader of the organization. Let's kind of talk, Ryan, first. Start like, where are you from and what got you interested in the world of anti-doping?
Yeah, it was kind of a long and winding road to get here. I grew up in the northeast of the U.S., so New Jersey is where home was. I lived and went to high school there, played a variety of different sports growing up. Baseball and football were my two main sports, but I also wrestled for a couple of years and just really kept active in the sports scene as best as I could. Through high school, again, really focused on football as my main sport. Was looking at a couple different colleges to go continue my fledgling athletic career at that point, and play football, and looked at a couple different schools, but decided to go to Westchester University in Pennsylvania, and decided that football was just not in the cards for me when it came to that. So upon going to college in Pennsylvania, really focused on education. I went into my university time there looking at really continuing to work within the field of sports. So I really looked at athletic training as a major initially, and then ended up gravitating more towards the exercise science field. So I was a kinesiology major and had an athletic coaching minor through the university there. And then right out of college, I went to work for an organization who was doing speed, agility, quickness, and strength training for athletes. So was a NSCA, CPT, and personal trainer, did that for a number of years and really focused on speed, agility, quickness, strength training with athletes from high school level athletes all the way up to professional and Olympic athletes. So really kept trying to find any way to stay involved in the sports world. After that, I was being groomed to run one of their facilities and just realized I didn't have a lot of management background at that point. So really just decided I was going to go back to school to focus a little bit more on the management side of things, to learn that, to advance my career. And started looking at some programs both here in the U.S. as well as overseas, and found a sports management master's program that I really liked in the UK. Okay. And just happened to be traveling that summer. Decided to check out the school, check out the campus when I was in the UK, and really that solidified things that I wanted to take the plunge, move to the UK, to England, and start a master's program. So later that year, I decided to do just that. I started a master's program in sports and recreation management at the University of Sheffield. So it's in the northern part of England, and really focused on the role that sport plays from a management side of things. And it was really unique to learn that the European model of sports is very different than the American style of model of sports. And just learning about the two differences and the promotion and relegation system that a lot of European sports and a lot of the rest of the world has within their professional sports structure varied greatly from what the U.S. was doing in their professional sports careers. And then from there, I ended up really having a class in sports law, and that was really something that resonated with me. I was really intrigued by that. Ended up finding a second master's program in the UK that focused on international sports law. Mm-hmm. And through that program, I really focused a lot of my thesis project on the legal ramifications of doping control within sports. And so that was really my first foray into anti-doping. And like I said, it was kind of a long and winding road to get there. But through that research that I was doing into anti-doping, I came across a company called International Doping Testing and Management, and they were based out of Sweden. And they were doing the doping control drug testing program for a lot of the international federations, one of which was the International Tennis Federation. And when reaching out to them for information, I just really became intrigued by the drug testing program and how that works and how it is incorporated into not only professional sports, but also Olympic type sports, and use that to come on board with them as an international doping control officer. I moved back to the States, and one of the first jobs that they had for me, and this is a part-time thing, was to follow around the pro tennis tour here in the North American swing, and got to travel to do a couple of the different tour stops in North America. So got to know the in-competition doping control process versus the out-of-competition doping control process. And it just worked out really well, right place, right time. And that culminated with working the US Open that summer. Okay. And it was just a great atmosphere, great event. And that was really what really sold me on the anti-doping process itself.
Okay. So if you could just describe to the listeners, I'm very familiar with what a doping control officer is, or DCO. What would entail sort of your work, as a DCO? What would you do? Sort of what would a day look like for a doping control officer?
Yeah, and it's certainly not the most luxurious role ever, but it's certainly one that's very instrumental in the process. So the doping control officer has a few different roles. They will, for the most part, first, I'll take a step back. They will get instructions from the company, whether it's U.S. Anti-Doping Agency or a national anti-doping agency, specific doping control organization. Like back in the day, I worked for IDTM, International Doping Testing and Management. They would send me a list of athletes that needed to be tested out of competition. Out of competition testing is totally different than in-competition testing, in the sense that you will be given a list of athletes, you'll be given access to their whereabouts information, so where they live, where they train, what time that they would be available for a doping control test, and then you would basically plan your day around that.
Okay.
So I would show up typically where they're training or where they live when it comes to an out of competition test. You notify the athlete, you let them know about the process, you show them all your credentials and the authorization to do the test so they know it's not just some random person showing up on their doorstep looking for this. And then the procedure was a little bit different, whether you were doing a urine test or a blood test at that point. And you go through the proper procedures when it comes to both of those tests. And again, it's not the most glamorous of jobs because you're basically watching a urine sample be processed or a blood sample be taken, or you're doing the blood draw yourself. And then you maintain those samples and then ship them to the laboratory who does the analysis. So as a doping control officer, you're a very small piece in this broader program. But it was interesting until I came into this role within the PCC, I didn't really know what happened next. So it was great. The piece that I knew being a doping control officer was just a very narrow sliver of what the doping control process looks like. So it was great to see that. And then the in competition testing is different. Obviously, you're showing up to an event where typically multiple athletes are going to be there. For the most part, they know they're going to be drug tested or go through the anti-doping process. And you will test multiple athletes over multiple days. Like I said, at the U.S. Open, we were there for the main 2 weeks of the draw, and we were doing a handful of testing every day. So it would be urine or blood or both, depending on the athlete.
So what I find interesting, it's super cool to kind of see, because that's really where everything starts, right? I mean, obviously with the collection of the sample from the athlete. So when you call them, do you give them a 24-hour heads up, or is it something, okay, during the hours of 9 a.m. and 12, p.m., this athlete's supposed to be at their house, and you just randomly show up unannounced? If that's the case, I mean, do you ever find like, okay, they're not here, maybe they, ran to the store real quick to grab some food? Sort of talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so it was when I really started out as a doping control officer in the early 2000s. So technology has definitely changed a lot since I started back then. Back then, it was really paper copies, or I was being emailed whereabouts information for an athlete, and we were still doing everything handwritten on the forms. So a lot of it was really, a lot of the planning was on me. That they would list on their whereabouts information where they would train for an hour, a couple hours each day, and their home address. And then I would really put that together. At that time, we were not able to give them any advance notice. So it was really just showing up on the doorstep or while they're training, and you have to hope that they're there. So I utilized that, and it did get a little frustrating sometimes. There were times where you would show up. Yeah, I remember a handful of times, like I showed up and the lights are off at their house. Obviously, we didn't see them at the training location, and you have to wait you had to wait a mandatory hour at any location to make sure that they didn't come back or they weren't trying to avoid you. And there was one athlete in particular that went through all of that, contacted the company later that day, heard back from them the next morning that, actually the athlete was in Europe training or in Europe at a competition. And I was like, I guess you didn't have that information then. It always made it interesting. But for the most part, the athletes were where their whereabouts information said they were going to be. Okay. And we're very good about doing that.
Now, I guess with technology, things have definitely changed as far as I'm sure there's an app or something they would log into and say, okay, if I'm leaving the state or the country or wherever I'm going, I'm guessing they could update that schedule so the current doping control officers would be able to see that live.
Yes. And that is exactly it. The doping control officers have access to the app, and an athlete can change their whereabouts, location. I think they have to do it within 59 minutes of whatever their testing window is. So nowadays, I believe, and I could be wrong here, a lot of athletes, at least on the Olympics side of things, will have to state a specific 1 hour window every day that they're available and that they will be at a location for you to find them. So that could be at training, it could be at their house, depending on what they prefer to put down. They have to make any modifications to that at least 59 minutes before that window. So that, and a DCO or someone could adapt or adjust accordingly. So technology has definitely helped, I think, from the DCO out of competition process.
Okay. Yeah. And I find that interesting just because, you know, people see, really, when you see an athlete, they're on TV, they're competing. You know, and I know there's a lot of shows and YouTube videos and stuff about the training piece. And it's all very glamorous, but when it comes to something like this, I could imagine that, like being an athlete, that could be really inconvenient too. You know, I need to let somebody know where I am, and then you're sitting there kind of waiting. Well, are they not going to show up? And then, you know, man, I really need to run to the store and grab something, but then I'll come back. You know, but what would happen? And I guess this will be my last question on this, just because I'm interested. What would happen if you were coming to test me? And it's not that I'm trying to avoid you, but it's like, look, I don't know who's at the door. I'm not answering it. Or, you know, you showed up at my practice facility and maybe I had wrapped up early, or I planned on coming in a little bit later, and you go a day or two without seeing me. What would happen ultimately at that point?
Yeah, so the way the process works is that if a doping control officer either cannot find you or you're not where you're supposed to be, they would report back to whoever's authorizing the test. So in the tennis situation, back when I was doing it, it was either the ATP, the WTA, or the ITF that were authorizing those tests. Now, within tennis, they now have the ITIA, who oversees the anti-doping program for all of tennis. So the ITIA would get the results of this back to them, and then they would determine whether it was a missed test or not. So if an athlete is deemed to have missed a test for whatever reason, either by their own fault or the DCO's fault or something along those lines, they will get a notification of this missed test. Now, within the Olympic movement, at least, and professional sports has a different protocol, but within the Olympic type sports movement, if you are found to have, I think it's 3 missed tests within a calendar year or 3 missed tests within a certain period of time, then you can basically be seen as having a doping violation. So
Okay.
a lot of times they're seeing that on the Olympic movement as you're trying to avoid the process or you're trying to impede on the process. Now, that's not always the case, obviously.
Yeah.
If that does happen and someone has 3 missed tests within a certain time period, they're able to appeal that to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, who will then dig into it a little bit more and either uphold those sanctions or basically take away those sanctions. So it really depends. It's
Okay.
a very lengthy process.
Yeah, and I mean, today
yeah.
with technology, I mean, it's, you know, there's really no excuse. I mean, I'd understand you miss 1 or you miss 2, but you start missing 3, and it's like, come on. I mean, are you not checking your phone or your email or whatever the case might be?
Correct. And for the most part, when I was a doping control officer and involved in this process, a lot of the athletes that you engage with and interact with, they know that this is their profession. This is part of their job. It's not the best part of their job and certainly not the part that they like the most. However, most athletes, I would say a large percentage, know that it's part of their process, it's part of their job, and that they're happy to be a part of that, to be honest.
Okay. Interesting. Well, no, I appreciate you explaining that, just because it gives sort of a different perspective to the world of anti-doping and sort of what an athlete is subject to as being, a professional athlete. But what I'd like to do, Ryan, is kind of change gears and dive into talking about the Partnership for Clean Competition, which, like the Taylor Hooten Foundation, you guys are a 501c3 nonprofit organization founded in 2008 by the U.S. Olympic Committee, Major League Baseball, and the National Football League. Can you educate us on why the PCC was founded and sort of give us what the mission of the PCC is?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, actually, this year marks the 15th anniversary of the PCC and the founding of the PCC. So as you said, in 2008, the four founding members, so the U.S. Olympic Committee at that time, now the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, Major League Baseball, the National Football League, and the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency came together to form this charity, this legal entity that would oversee the research side of anti-doping within the U.S. sports collective at that point. And really in 2008, there were a lot of things going on. Well, prior to 2008, there were a lot of things going on in the anti-doping space. You had the Balco scandal. You had the steroids issue within Major League Baseball. You had a lot of different things going on in the Olympic movement with anti-doping. You have Lance Armstrong and all of those things, and timing kind of played into it. It was kind of the right place, the right time. And the real two leaders in the conversation were, at that point, Major League Baseball and the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, to really come together to pool their resources, work together and collaborate together, and really invest more funding and more clout into the anti-doping research and science. And then bringing on board the NFL and USOPC, or USOC at that time, it just really worked well to establish the Partnership for Clean Competition when it came to that. And really the mission of the PCC is to protect the integrity of sport and public health by engaging and supporting the world's top scientists and innovators in high quality anti-doping research and development. So right there in our mission, the real main focus of the organization is that research side of the anti-doping movement. So we're not out there creating a lot of the rules and the laws when it comes to anti-doping. The World Anti-Doping Agency does a lot of that for the Olympic type sports. And then you have the leagues here in the US that do that for the professional sports. So we weren't coming in as kind of this rule-making body, or the PCC was not developed to be that role. It was really to bring together research, scientists, innovators that can advance the anti-doping movement from that side of things. And today, that's still our main goal, our main mission, is to fund high-quality, cutting-edge research and development within the anti-doping sports space.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you explained it the way you did, just because you guys aren't obviously that governing body like some of the other anti-doping organizations out there are. And for those of you that are interested or that are a normal All Me podcast listener, we did have an opportunity to interview John Coyles for Major League Baseball to talk about sort of the evolution of their drug testing program, especially following the congressional hearings in the Mitchell report. So that's a very interesting episode. I'll put a link down to that in the show notes. But the PCC is obviously a very important organization as it relates to the world of anti-doping. And you guys are funding some really great work. What are some of the projects that you fund?
Yeah, so we have a number of different avenues of what we do and how we work. So we do it through four main kind of areas. So we have our grants program. So we have an annual open competition, open call for proposals for researchers and scientists and laboratories to submit proposals to us through this main grants program. And what is unique about the way the PCC really does our grant intake is we do a pre-application. So an organization or a researcher can do a shorter kind of application form to us so that we know that they're right on track with what they're looking to research. It's meeting the research priorities of the organization. And that's a big thing that we really emphasize within the Partnership for Clean Competition. We have a detailed list of research priorities of projects that we will fund and we're looking to fund. And normally, well, every time, all of the projects that are submitted to us have to fall within that research priority category. Mm-hmm. So it's a way for us to weed out those that are not applicable to what the organization would fund. Mm-hmm. So that pre-application deadline is usually a month before the full application deadline. And at that pre-application, as I said, it's a shorter application process where they will submit to the PCC for review, and then we authorize them to either go forward to the full application round or not, and we provide them that feedback. So we have the co-chairs of our scientific advisory board will review those proposals and basically assess whether they should move forward to the full application round. Then when it comes to the full application round, they would submit those proposals by the deadline. And then we convene our scientific advisory board. So we have 12 members on our scientific advisory board that will then review these proposals that come in for their merits on how well the proposal is formulated, the process is formulated, whether it meets the research priorities, their impact on anti-doping in general, and how feasible the project is to be completed and to have impact on anti-doping. So we pull together these 12 individuals who will review these projects, and they will recommend whether a project should be funded or not within the PCC. So to take it one step further, so then those recommendations are then brought to our board of governors. So we have a 4-person board of governors who helps me in determining which projects we should fund based on the amount of funding the organization has available in any given cycle, the focus on the research priorities, as well as the overall kind of appeal for the Partnership for Clean Competition. So it's a multi-phase step that we go through for the grants process.
Okay.
We have a couple other avenues that we fund projects. We also have a microgrants program where if a project or a researcher just needs a little bit of funding and a shorter amount of time to do really a proof of concept study that would then lead to a bigger, broader project within anti-doping, or they have a very short window to conduct a study, whether it's 3 months or 6 months, then they can apply to us for funding, and we can turn that around a little bit quicker for these shorter term projects. So right now we're actually going through a review of our microgrants program and really assessing whether the timeline, less than 6 months, and the funding amounts are necessary for those projects. So it's been a great way for me to really dive into the microgrants process over the last year or so. So that's been great. And then we have 2 other avenues, our fellowship program. So the Partnership for Clean Competition Fellowship Program is really a way for us to empower and support the next generation of anti-doping scientists. And what we're doing is there's 2 different tracks. There's a laboratory track where the PA postdoc will work with a WADA accredited anti-doping laboratory around the world. And we fund these fellows all over the globe. And we will commit to 2 years of funding for them to work within the laboratory. So it's really just supplementing their salary at the location and providing them some research funds to work on projects so that we can keep kind of really that next generation of anti-doping scientists in the anti-doping movement so that they're not moving on to something a little bit more lucrative. It's always nice to move on to something more lucrative. There's not a ton of funding in anti-doping, but it's a way for us to keep kind of some of those great minds within anti-doping science. And then
Certainly
lastly, we have
definitely keeps the young brains engaged in what you're doing, or sort of like you've told us throughout this podcast, sort of what got you excited in this space. I didn't mean to interrupt, but just wanted to kind of interject there and just say, I mean, it was really what kind of brought you to the space. And I think, just with some of these younger minds and the creativity that they have, just keeping them engaged in the anti-doping space to obviously keep, sports a level playing field.
Absolutely. And as technology is changing, obviously the methodologies are changing. So the younger people coming into the field, and they may not have come into science as a field thinking, oh yeah, I want to work in anti-doping. They might have just stumbled upon it or found a way that the work that they were doing in medical research might be applicable to anti-doping or vice versa. So yeah, like you said, it's just a great way to keep the younger minds engaged in this field.
Yeah.
We have a number of working groups that we kind of run and facilitate over the years. So we've had a few that have been really focused on different topics. We have 4 active ones. One is in performance hematology, so really blood doping more than anything else. We have a second one focused on collagen turnover. We have one that is now no longer in existence, but it resulted in a lot of great research and a lot of technological advances within anti-doping that was focused on dried blood spot and dried plasma spot technology. And then we have 2 others. One was focused on exhaled breath analysis. And then we worked collaboratively with the World Anti-Doping Agency to identify reference materials that the laboratories need or utilize to use the standards to do a lot of the testing that they do. So through the working groups, we have a number of different projects that we fund. So really in a nutshell, that's the avenue of how we fund things. And that dovetails nicely into one of the biggest kind of success stories within anti-doping over the last handful of years, and the PCC was very impactful on this, was dried blood spot technology. And I know you were at the PCC conference, so you've probably seen and heard this quite a bit. But dried blood spot is a way to capture subcutaneous blood rather than intravenous blood and utilize that for anti-doping science. And we've specifically worked with Major League Baseball, U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, as well as the laboratory out in Utah to do a pilot study and field test a few years ago within dried blood spot technology. So working with minor league baseball and Major League Baseball, we were able to try out the different methodologies for dried blood spot. And it was really found that a device called the Tasso device was one that really worked out very well. It goes on the arm or on the leg and draws subcutaneous blood through the device that then trickles down into these dried blood spots. And the laboratories are able to use those dried blood spots to analyze against different substances in the blood. So what it's doing is, rather than having a blood control officer or a phlebotomist come out to draw intravenous blood on an athlete, they're able to do that. Either the DCO themselves or the athlete themselves are able to utilize this technology and not have to worry about missing a vein or causing issues with a blood draw. What we're also seeing through this DBS technology is that it's a lot cheaper than having to send out a phlebotomist or ship blood, serum blood, and it cuts down on a lot of costs. So I don't know if John Coyles from Major League Baseball went into this on the podcast episode that you had with him, but a lot of the technology, DBS technology, is being utilized within baseball, and it's really cutting down on a lot of costs where they're able to do more tests based on the same budget utilizing DBS technology versus intravenous blood draws. So we're seeing that a lot on the professional sports side, that it's really allowing them to save money and then reinvest that in their anti-doping programs, which is great. And the PCC was there from kind of the first studies that were involved in DBS technology and funded a lot of those studies over the years.
And I would imagine, just going out on a limb, thinking from an athlete's perspective, right? Because they're the one that's getting poked and prodded, and I'm one that I'm just not a big fan of needles. But from their perspective, it's got to be less invasive. I mean, have you gotten any sort of feedback from the athletes? Because I know obviously if it saves money, it makes it more efficient. You can do more testing. Obviously, that's better for clean sport. But from the athlete's perspective, did they seem to prefer the blood spot over having somebody take a vial of blood out of them?
Absolutely. Like you said, it's less invasive. It can cause less issues. And when you have a sport like baseball or tennis or even golf, where the athletes are using their arms in almost everything that they do, if you were to do a blood draw before or after a game and there's some complications or hematoma that develops after that, you could potentially miss out on a day of work or a game the next day or that current day based on that. So to try to alleviate that, yes, the DBS, there's very few issues that we've seen with that technology. It doesn't cause a lot of the issues that you might have seen from intravenous blood draw, and it's an easier process, quite frankly. And there's a lot of athletes that prefer that over the intravenous, just because it's all contained in the device. You actually, with the Tasso device specifically, you don't see the needle. It's in the device. So if you are needle phobic, so to speak, then to not see the needle definitely helps. I mean, I remember when I was a doping control officer doing blood draws with a number of athletes, and they just absolutely hated needles. One athlete that passed out when they saw the needle and just did not like it at all. So if we had that technology back in the early 2000s when I was working primarily in the DCO area, I think that would have helped a lot. And it would have saved a lot of issues.
Yeah, and I'll be sure, Ryan, to make sure we put a link and a picture of the Tasso device in the show notes so people can kind of get an understanding of what it is, how it works, that sort of thing, because it is quite fascinating, especially somebody like me. Now, I don't pass out when I get needles, but, if you do have to go get your blood drawn once a year, whatever the case might be, I don't like it. I don't like looking at it. The person wants to sit there and make small talk. It's like, dude, stick me with that needle, get my blood, and then get away from me. So again, I think that's super cool. But for somebody that's currently looking for a grant, what information would you provide them that, the PCC might be a good fit for that source of funding? I mean, can it be an individual? Can it be a university? Is it just laboratory research? If you could kind of try to give us some high level points on that. So somebody that might be listening say, hey, I might be a good fit for a grant. So they're not wasting their time. They know, hey, at least I'm in the wheelhouse to apply.
Yeah, we have a lot of great resources on our website that really identifies what is involved in the process and walks you through a lot of those frequently asked questions. So we can kind of delve into that a little bit. But first and foremost, it's making sure that whatever project you're looking to research or get going fits within our research priorities. So as I alluded to earlier, the Partnership for Clean Competition has a list of research priorities on our website. And if there are projects that fall outside of that scope and don't necessarily fit within one of those research priorities, typically we're not going to fund it because that's outside of really the scope and purview of what we're looking to do. So that's the main gauge. Then from there, it's looking at, okay, well, what impact will this have on the anti-doping world? And we have funded projects that come through anti-doping laboratories. So as I alluded to earlier, I believe the World Anti-Doping Agency has, I think there's 32 or 33 accredited laboratories across the globe. So it could be affiliated with one of those laboratories. However, we also work with a number of universities that are doing some research into anti-doping science and technology. So across the U.S., there's a number of universities that we've worked with or funded over the years. That being said, there's also other entities. There's other organizations, either for-profit, not-for-profit organizations that will help us develop some of the reference materials and different standards across the lab. So it could be a commercial laboratory that is doing some work within anti-doping science. And if we need a new reference material for a certain assay or certain thing, then we can help fund them to develop those assays or those different things to be utilized within the anti-doping laboratory. Typically, when it comes to an individual, that's a lot tougher, because if an individual is applying to us, it doesn't necessarily mean that they would be disqualified, but we would want to ensure that they have access to the resources to be able to complete a study like this. So they have to be affiliated with a laboratory or a university or an organization that has the equipment that you can do some of these studies. So that's really where, when you say an individual, that would be a little bit more difficult. Okay. However, each of these projects, or each of the projects that come to us, are being proposed by a principal investigator or someone who's leading the project. They will have done their due diligence, and they have all the resources in place that they can do the study that they're proposing. However, it's usually championed by one individual. So it's kind of that double-edged sword. There is an individual that's taking the lead on this, but it's usually not just an individual. It's usually a team behind them as well.
Okay. No, and I appreciate you clarifying that. And Ryan, what I'll also do is I'll put, a link in the show notes to the frequently asked questions page. So if anybody out there is interested in doing a grant or whatever the case might be, they can go and start there first. But I do want to make sure we talk about the annual PCC conference that, I've had the pleasure of taking a part of over the past number of years, all the way from at the NFL headquarters to King's College in London, which was really, really neat, to even, the Major League Baseball headquarters, which was beautiful, by the way, this past year. So the 2023 conference. So let's start by talking, what are the overall goals of the conference? If I was in the anti-doping space, what is something I might see there that would be interesting to kind of encourage more people to go? Because there is a lot of fascinating information. You're getting some of the new information on the cutting edge technology. Like I know a lot of the dried blood spots was talked about at the last conference. So if you could kind of give us an overview of that, Ryan, so any listeners out there that might be interested, saying, hey, I didn't even know a conference like this existed, it's something I might want to attend.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Partnership for Clean Competition, really since its inception, has tried to figure out a way to convene a lot of the world's top researchers, scientists, those people working within anti-doping science, not only the ones that we're directly funding through PCC funding, but really as a platform and a way to convene everyone to come together to talk about anti-doping science and research. And really that's where the PCC conference evolved from. We actually do it every 2 years. So prior to the one that we hosted this past April, the last conference was in 2019, as you alluded to, in association with King's College London in the UK. And the next one was supposed to be in 2021. The pandemic put a little bit of a wait and see on that one. So we weren't able to hold the one in 2021. But naturally back on cycle with the 2023 conference that was just at Major League Baseball's new headquarters in New York. And we're very lucky, again, through the partnerships that we have with Major League Baseball, the NFL, U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, and U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, as well as, and I'd be remiss to mention them, the PGA Tour. They're another sponsor of ours over the years. They're not one of the 4 core founding members, but the PGA Tour has been able to provide us a lot of support over the years. So through our partners, we're able to work with them to bring to light this great kind of international conference focused on anti-doping science. So the one in 2023, this past April, was our theme for this one was the impact of global anti-doping scientific research, really focused on innovation and advancement. So as you said, we not only focused on some of the great science that we're funding through these projects, we're also looking at it from the technological advances that have been developed through anti-doping science over the years. And one of those is dried blood spot and the Tasso device, and Innovero, which is a company that was stood up here in the United States as another alternative for drug collection kits. So historically, there's been one or two companies that have led the market on doping control materials or resources, and Innovero is really one of the newest players and one of the more technological advanced companies that is helping in that space. So that was great to see some of those technological advances. But we also highlighted a lot of the work that is being done by some of the fellows that we have funded over the last few years, and showcased how their projects really fit within the PCC and advancing technology here in the U.S. So it was a little bit of everything at the conference, and that's really how we like to have it. We don't want it just to be this high-level scientific conversation, because then you lose the people who don't work in the science side of things. We didn't want it to be too far on the government oversight or the administrative process, because then you lose some of the scientists. You didn't want it too far into the legal side of the anti-doping movement, because then you lose everyone else. So we tried to make it as kind of cohesive as we could over the day and a half, almost 2 days of conference. And I think, and I hope we did a good job really finding that happy medium and being able to involve all the key players within anti-doping to showcase the great work that we're doing at the PCC through the grants, through the research, through the advocacy, and really just, again, bring it back to what the innovation and advances in technology have really led to within the anti-doping space. So I defer to you to let me know if you think that we were able to achieve at least part of that.
No, you absolutely do. And in fact, you do a wonderful job of that balancing act, if you will, trying to bring in the research, the legal, the government, the oversight piece, because again, it's a very broad space. But there are sessions where, you have a scientist who's very brilliant that is using a lot of words as they describe some of the research or the testing that they're looking at, where as a layperson, it's very hard to understand. But that's only maybe one session where, there's a lot of other sessions talking about, obviously like the dried blood spots and some of the new testing technology and collection technology that is certainly fascinating, that, it really does play to the entire audience. But you guys do a great job. It's always a lot of fun. You get to see a lot of people. It's a great opportunity to network. Obviously, in Major League Baseball's new offices, they were beautiful and the food was great. So it's definitely something, if you were in the anti-doping space, I've told this to people over and over. Ryan, you guys do a really good job of being hosts and, making everybody feel welcome. And it also, again, provides a great opportunity and platform, especially for a smaller organization like us, for us to network and get to know other people within the industry. And also, most importantly, we've gotten 2 or 3 different experts from the PCC conference, with 2 or 3 more sort of waiting in the wings that we've been able to interview for our podcast, because as we're out, we do get questions from young people as far as, is human growth hormone safe, or, what anabolic steroids are safe, or, they have questions about testing or whatever the case might be. And we always like to defer to the experts on those. So we talk at it and during our programs at a very high level, but having the opportunity to meet some of the folks that we have at the PCC conference has allowed us to also expand our messaging and provide our listeners, a more in-depth discussion on the topics that they're most interested in. Lastly, I know you guys have a podcast as well, kind of a good transition point there. Where can people find more information about your podcast, and what are some of the topics that they might expect to hear from the PCC?
Yeah, we have the anti-doping podcast, which we run in conjunction with a company called Unfold Productions, and Dr. Marie McNeely is our host for that. And it's great for us because she's a scientist by trade. She certainly knows the scientific field, so she can hold her own with a lot of the scientists that we have on there. But she's just a very personable person and can work with any of our guests that are on the podcast and really make them feel comfortable and get the best out of them. So the Anti-Doping Podcast is our podcast. And you just recorded a session for us. So
Yep.
We utilized the PCC conference in the same way. We were able to bring other perspectives and other people to our podcast. And really, our podcast is very diverse in the sense where we could have a scientist on there talking about the latest and greatest in science that they're working on or projects that the PCC is funding. We also have laboratory staff who can come on and talk about how some of the research that we're funding is being integrated into the laboratories themselves and the testing methodologies that they're doing. We've had a number of our fellows on that really talk about their transition from the academic scientific world to working in a laboratory, to sports professionals and league professionals that are administrating the anti-doping programs globally, domestically, wherever. So we do try to keep it as broad as possible, as long as it's relevant within the anti-doping space. It was interesting when I first joined the PCC almost 2 years ago now. I recorded an episode, and it was really just about my background and how I came about into the anti-doping space again. And it was just a great way for me to get an entree and get my voice out there to kind of our constituents or the people that we work with. So it's just a really great platform. And the one that you all are doing as well with the All Me podcast is, again, just another way to get information in the hands of people and hopefully try to change some of the perspectives or some of the opinions when it comes to anti-doping and steroids and the different factors when it comes to that. So yeah, I've really enjoyed being involved and listening to the sessions that we put together through the Anti-Doping podcast and learning a lot through that as well. I don't necessarily come from a scientific background, so I do rely on our scientific advisory board and others that know the science in and out to really advise me or provide some of that context. But just listening to our anti-doping podcast and some of the scientists that we bring on there, they make a lot of the science that we fund and the science that they're doing relatable. It's a lot of it, more than I thought probably would have gone over my head, does not, based on some of the ways that they're explaining it and the way that they can really just disseminate the information that they're working on. So it's been great. It really has been.
No, it's really good. And what I'll do is I'll also put a link to the anti-doping podcast in the show notes so people are able to click on that link. But Ryan, you've been very generous with your time. And before I let you go, this part of our podcast, if you are an avid listener, this is our curveball round. So I have 3 questions that are totally unrelated to anti-doping or any of the work that you're doing. They're a lot of fun. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to ask that you let me read the question to you. Just first thing that comes to mind, just go ahead and answer that question. You let me know when you're ready and we'll get started.
All right. Sounds good. Let's do it.
All right. First question is, what is the best vacation you've ever taken and why?
Aside from my honeymoon, which I had a great honeymoon. We went to French Polynesia. It was one of the best places I've ever been. My wife and I were actually just recently in Greenland. And Greenland is one of those places that's certainly off the beaten path, and it was absolutely beautiful. We were there in midsummer, and it was still 40 to 50 degrees. It was very comfortable. The scenery is absolutely amazing. You're looking out your window and you're seeing icebergs float by, and just some of the hikes that we went on, the wildlife that we engaged, the food that we had, that was just one of the best places I've ever been. And when we do travel, we like to experience the culture, and there's certainly culture abound in Greenland.
Well, neat. No, thanks for sharing. I think you're the only human being on the planet that I know that's ever been there. So that's really cool to hear. All right. So here's the second question for you. What was the last show that you binge watched?
Oh, good question. My wife and I, we get recommendations from a number of different people and friends of ours recommended a show called The Great. And it was really kind of this satire, humor, comedy based on Catherine the Great, loosely. And that was probably the last one that we binge watched.
Okay. Yeah, I might have to check that out. I'm always looking for different shows, especially with as much travel as I do. We got 2 little kids at home, so trying to manage any sort of show at home is impossible. When you're in the air and you can't get Wi-Fi, sometimes the best thing to do is binge watch a show. All right, last and final question. If you could have coffee with one athlete, dead or alive, who would it be?
Oh, that's a tough one.
I figured that would be.
Yeah. Being a baseball fan more than probably some of the others, I am really intrigued, and being a Yankees fan, Babe Ruth really comes to mind. Just some of the great work that he did, and quite frankly, I don't know how much coffee he drank, but from rumors had it, I think he was more imbibing on other things. It would be great just to grab a drink with him, period, and hear some of the stories and hear a little bit more about his life and where he got to be one of the greatest of all time. And I think it would be an interesting conversation to have.
Yeah, very interesting you said that, simply because I always think about these questions, what my answers would be. And my answer is Babe Ruth as well. And I'd love to show him the game today versus, the game, he was accustomed to playing, just to talk about some of the differences and the challenges that they faced during that time, and maybe some of the things that he sees that have improved in the game and even today. But I want to thank you again, Ryan, for taking your time out to join us here on the All Me podcast. We appreciate everything that you're doing. And like I said throughout the podcast, I'll be sure to put all of these notes into our show notes that some of our guests can take a look at and click the links. But, again, thank you so much for all that you're doing.
Thank you very much. It was great to be a part of this, and great to interact with you, and really, again, just talk a little bit more about what some of the work that the PCC is doing, and my small role in that, obviously. Thank you again for all that you do as well, the Taylor Hooten Foundation, for all that you're doing in the anti-doping space. It's great to collaborate more on these projects.
Yeah, again, and we look forward to continuing our relationship with you.
Absolutely, us too.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, a nonprofit organization leading a national campaign to enlighten people to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances, and inspiring people to live and compete without the use of these substances. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and tune in to our next episode.